The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to oppose this legislation, although it is understood that what will happen is that the government will gut its own legislation through a series of amendments that it has flagged to actually remove parts 3, 4, 5, 7 and 8 of the bill. And that is, of course, I think, symbolic of what the government has done when it comes to the national broadband network, because the government has gutted its own policies when it comes to the NBN. I had the great honour of being the Communications Minister at the end of the period in which we were in office. And what I saw was professional public servants, professional board led by its chair, Siobhan McKenna, and an organisation that is so important for transforming Australia's infrastructure. Of course, when the current Prime Minister, who became the Communications Minister after the election and was appointed by his dear friend Tony Abbott as the Shadow Minister for Communications, he was given the task of destroying the NBN. That was the task, direct quote from Tony Abbott when appointing Malcolm Turnbull as the Shadow Minister for Communications. I, of course, think that he was very much the Shadow Minister for fraudband rather than broadband, and, of course, the copper economy rather than the digital economy. And what we saw is that Malcolm Turnbull, as the Communications Minister, has indeed set about on destroying the NBN. There's a fundamental difference of views. One, we on this side of the House supported fibre to the premise, fibre to the home and fibre to the business. And we saw that as being as essential as enabling people to connect up with water or electricity or other utilities, because fibre and fast-speed broadband isn't something that should be kept from people on the basis of their income. It is something that should be seen as accessible for all. Those opposite with the approach of the current Prime Minister, it is a very different philosophical view. You have, of course, fibre to the node or fibre to the fridge type box on the corner of streets, and then, of course, the old copper wire into people's homes or into people's businesses. But, of course, if people are wealthy enough, then they can connect up to high-speed broadband through fibre. Yep. So we change it from a universal system to one that reflects people's wealth. And one of the things that is extraordinary is that in 2016, access to high-speed broadband is essential for any student at school. It's essential for any business, and it's particularly important in regional Australia. One of the issues of the NBN is that access to high-speed broadband can, in a country such as Australia, break down some of those spatial inequalities that are there. If you can establish a business in a regional centre like Coffs Harbour, where I turned on the NBN as the Minister and as Deputy Prime Minister in 2013, then that makes living in those regional cities and towns much more attractive because, of course, the overheads of living in a regional city are often far less in terms of rent or ownership of a business premise than if you're in the CBD of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Perth. So the NBN we saw as very much an equity issue, that the national broadband network should be rolled out right around the country. And we know that that is world's best practice. We know that in government we achieved the structural separation of Telstra and other significant reforms which essentially had laid dormant under 12 years of the Howard government. So in terms of the principles that were being rolled out, the government has this absurd proposition that somehow they have a mandate for what they are doing. But of course, when people have been critical of the NBN, such as journalists at the ABC, they quite clearly have been intimidated into not being able to express their views. Indeed, it's quite extraordinary that an article written by Emma Alberici, written after she hosted a debate between myself and the now Prime Minister on Late Line, was published after the federal election and not before, because of so-called checks that needed to take place. But of course, while in opposition, Malcolm Turnbull had this to say: "We are going to do a rigorous analysis. We will get Infrastructure Australia to do an independent cost-benefit analysis." So instead of appointing, though, Infrastructure Australia, which is what Malcolm Turnbull said repeatedly in terms of those issues, Mr Turnbull appointed a collection of former Liberal Party staffers and advisors and critics of the National Broadband Network to conduct his cost-benefit analysis. And the Senate Select Committee, of course, into the NBN had a look at the Vertigan panel's independent cost-benefit analysis to broadband, and what that Senate Select Committee highlighted was a number of absolute shortcuts and failures when it came to a proper cost-benefit analysis. And the extraordinary circumstance now whereby the government has purchased in 2016 through the National Broadband Network some 1,800,000 metres of copper was the last amount that was purchased, is almost beyond belief in 2016. But what that shows is just how hopeless the government's approach was. And that's why, of course, what we've seen from the government is a doubling of costs and a halving of speed under the government's own analysis. And of course, the costs appear to be going up and up and up. And of course, you had the extraordinary payment to Telstra for the existing network. I mean, it takes a special kind of profligacy to engage with Telstra the way that they did. They're now finding out, funnily enough, in the strategic review that took place in December 2013, they said it would cost $55 million to fix up the copper. 2 years later, they're saying that figure is $641 million. So a much more than tenfold increase. In the strategic review, they said that there'd be $2.5 billion revenue this year and next. Now, they say that figure is $1.1 billion, or much less than half. They said that fibre to the node cost per home would be $600. The actual cost 2 years later, they find, is $1,600. So an increase of 167%. And all of those issues show what a failure it has been. Indeed, this government, when it comes to the NBN, shows, I think, its lack of vision for this nation. There can be no more visionary project than the NBN, because the NBN will have an impact not just on our economy, but the way that education services are delivered, the way that health services are delivered, the way that our entire national economy functions, but importantly as well, the way that regional economies function. And that's why it's so disappointing that the National Party tail has just wagged itself at the end of the Liberal Party dog, failed to stand up for the interests of regional Australia when it comes to the NBN. And there are people over there, including the now leader of the National Party, who used to say quite strong things about universal service obligations and the need to have the same service available in the bush that happened in the city, but they're pretty quiet about that now. Because fundamentally, this government stands condemned by the fact that Malcolm Turnbull said that the rollout of the NBN would be completed in 2016. This year. It is 2016 at 25 megabits per second, minimum speed. This Prime Minister also went down to Tasmania and said very clearly, that the Tasmanian rollout, which was contracted, would be continued and should have been completed by now. Everyone in Tasmania, by now, right now, was going to get access to the NBN. And yet you can stand on a street in Launceston and look across the road. One side doesn't get it, the other side does get it.
Shame.
An extraordinary impact, of course, on house prices that the government likes to consider that they're interested in, due to an accident of where the lines were drawn on the map. Because the people who missed out are going to miss out forever under this government's plan, because they won't get fibre to the premise. So I think this goes to the heart of competence of the person that we now have as the Prime Minister. Yep. He made big promises. He was very critical of the former government. He did have one job and one job only. He didn't do anything else, didn't do media reform, didn't do anything else except maybe plot against Prime Minister Abbott.
To be fair, that took a long time.
He certainly was very conscious of that, spending time on public transport, taking selfies, which he now, of course, doesn't fund. But the fact is that a doubling of the cost, a halving of the speed, an inequitable distribution so that we'll have haves and have-nots, suburbs divided on the basis of access to NBN shows, and the delay in times, the blowout in terms of delivery, show that this Prime Minister couldn't deliver as Communications Minister, so it's no wonder that he's all at sea when it comes to providing national leadership for Australia.
The question is that this bill